My name's Sam Phelan.
Thank you very much.
I'm not appearing on behalf of anybody except myself, my family,
That's
and
fine.
other Territorians.
Thank you. Most
I had
important.
big plans, but I've been very sick the last few days and now have sick kids at home, so I'm back to basics and having read half your inquiry.
But pithy basics are very commendable.
They're significant in this context. I've been in the Northern Territory for 20 years. I'm married to an Indigenous Territorian, and I have 3 children who intend to live out their lives here at this point, and we certainly intend to live our lives out here. We live in Katherine now, and as a result are smacked in the face daily by a PFOS situation and what water contamination looks like. Where we live, we back directly onto the pumping station that is now the dilution effect for the PFOS in the Katherine water system. And I had the pleasure of being taken up by a friend for a joyride in a helicopter the other day and was able to actually observe the fragility of the Katherine River system from the air. And it's something I hadn't even appreciated before, because as you're walking next to it every afternoon as I take dogs or kids for a walk, it seems like a really big, really sustainable system. And when you see it as this tiny little line from the air, you realise just how important water is to our livelihood. And if we are talking dilution, we've got to dilute it from somewhere else. So where are we obtaining that water from to dilute? I mean, dilution's wonderful if you can do it. But at some point, we won't have enough clean water to dilute our dirty water. And that's a very fast appearing reality in the Northern Territory. And are any of you from the Northern Territory? You are?
Yes.
Sort of picture. But I think it's really important because it is a really different context that you are working in. The idea that you will have a regulatory regime that will function in this place under the current climate, or any climate that I've seen here and attempted to watch be developed, is farcical. The more remote you go, the more poor any practice is. And that is broad, that is in building, that is in mining, that is in education, that is in health. And we're talking about really remote areas. And you can bet your bottom dollar that they will take shortcuts, because everybody does in every field. And the importance of knowing that context for you people is really important, because we're in a situation where we have very clearly a green light being given to industry by the government. I appreciate your efforts, and your efforts are incredibly important in the context that they are placed here, because we have industry really keen to move, and we have a government really keen to move that industry, and that is both sides of government. And irrespective of what the rhetoric is, I've now been watching this space for 6 years quite intently. And I've talked to politicians on either side of government when they've been in government and out of government, and I've heard their responses when they've been in opposition, and both of them have an underpinning contract with these gas companies that this will move, this will go. And that, I see you looking a little doubtful about that, and I can understand.
There's a moratorium in place.
Pardon?
There is a moratorium in place. That was achieved.
Place, and that was a really strategic political decision coming into the last election, which, to be honest, they probably didn't need to ask the government that we had in place. But it was another strategic political move, to be honest. But I've heard nothing in my meetings with government, and I've met with some pretty high people in government, to suggest that there is uniform support for a reservation in our approach to onshore development. You know, I don't sense from anybody that I speak to that there is true support for really holding back on this industry. The other thing, I've worked in remote communities for a large part of my Territory career. And when I hear consultation and what consultation has gone on, the minute I hear a meeting, as I just did from Origin, of 120 people to explain what's happened, I wonder what language that consultation is occurring in. Is it a presentation in English to 120 people sitting there? because I work daily with people, and my perception of what people understand and my absolute feeling of what people understand when I'm one-on-one in a workplace is so vastly different when it's put to the test in a tricky situation of what people's comprehension is, you know? So I would really question that unless all of that consultation is happening with true interpreters present and in very small clan groups, that you may as well say there hasn't been a consultation process. Certainly 120 people in a room with English as the language of, you know, the lecture given about what we've done in the last year isn't adequate as far as I'm concerned. And I have to question what informed consent is in a lot of these settings. I work in this area at the moment. I have friends in remote communities in this area, and I have a pretty good understanding of people's lack of understanding when it comes to this stuff. And the lack of understanding is enormous because you need a cultural perspective to even appreciate then what the process is. Like there's the shift of thought is quite different before you even understand the complexity of the mining process. So I just really doubt that informed consent from NLC in contracts really translates to what people have an understanding of what will happen on their country. And the complexities these days of what land tenure is and ownership and all of that is really complicated in a lot of places. Yeah, there's just a really nice quote that I only heard the other day, and it really applies to this whole situation. And it was a man talking about the Ganges River in India, and he just said to the person, they were on a Clean Up the Ganges campaign, and he said to the person, "She is my mother. She is the water that flows through my veins." And I think as a vet, I know that to be completely true, and that we are the driest continent on earth. And I don't think, and we are one of the driest places on that continent. And to be messing with what potentially may need to flow through our veins is enormous. And I've heard, you know, over the years I've been going to various meetings, and I've heard geohydrologists talk about the accumulation of data that would be required before a green light could be given as far as they were happy, you know, and a framework of 10 years seemed very, very, you know, very, very wanted by them in those settings. And I don't know to what extent individuals have contributed. A lot of people feel gagged by being employed by the government in the Northern Territory. Certainly when I've spoken to people, it has been reported to my director by 8 o'clock the next morning. So there is a very smallness to the Northern Territory that certainly will impact on the way people can speak out. And I think you need to be really cognizant of that in the work that you do as well. So I know a lot of government employees in Katherine who would love to be before this panel but feel that they can't be because of their position. And that stands across the Northern Territory. Even if you're just coming as I am today as a mother and a vet who happens to know a bit about these safe chemicals, people are feeling really compromised by their positions, and a lot of people in the Northern Territory are employed by government. So when I got actively involved, just a few things that still niggle, because I have talked and asked a lot of questions. I asked where the drill cut from Tanambrini went, and initially I was told that by the Department of Mines and Energy that it went to a municipal dump, which you could only assume was Laramar dump, but it could have been anywhere. They couldn't identify it. I was then told by the same CEO, Department of Mines and Energy, that no, that was all at Winnelli, in a storehouse. All 3 kilometres of it was at Winnelli in a storehouse, and that it was no trouble, didn't need to worry about where it was, because it was all at Winnelli. And now I'm told by Origin that all of theirs has gone to Brisbane, I think. So I'm just wondering where this drill cut is really going. It's a niggling question. I'm not saying anybody's lying. It just seems some strange, you know, as I've pursued different questions along the years, Another one is the water, the failed wells at the Georgina Basin. One failed well, Georgina Basin. I've asked where the water from that fracking procedure went to, and I was given a name of a processor at Mount Isa. When I phoned that processor with details of dates and all that sort of stuff, they had absolutely no record of it. So these are just questions that in a remote setting become really significant because it's out of sight, out of mind. And that's the reality of what we're entering into if we undertake this industry. I spoke to the EPA about the failed well at Georgina and just asked, when have you guys been there? What have you had a look at? Nothing, never. And those responses to me seem manifestly inadequate, but I don't know. That's just me as a punter. But it does seem strange that you would have a failed, I don't know if they even got as far as fracking, the Georgina well, but that you would have a failed well with an EPA saying, no, we haven't been there. This is 2 years ago, probably speaking to them. We haven't been there because all we'd see is a wellhead. What could we do with that? Which may well be true, but it's insufficient as far as I'm concerned. There's a little movie that I would like. Could we? There's a short movie and a long movie. If we could go the short one first. I'll just tell you the story before are the movies there? Only because it places, if you could just pause it for 1 sec, mate. What it does is, this is on the Barkly Highway and I was just driving along one day and I had actually become really quite disheartened by the whole push to frack the Northern Territory and had stepped away from the picture and just gone, you know what, I'm just going to be a mum, raise my kids and not buy into that story because I find it too heavy. And I was driving back across the Barkly and I came across this and it was a very spectacular vision which to people who live in the remote NT it's not that uncommon. And it was a murmuration of birds, so I don't know if any of you have seen them, but they are spectacular when you have birds that look like a tornado on the horizon and then stream out from that. And as I was driving, we pulled over because it was just overwhelming. They were just streaming everywhere. And I thought, you know what, one open evaporative pit, they were there because there was water, there was a bore that was leaking and there was water, in an odd place because of that leaking bore. So that's why they were doing what they were doing. And I thought one open evap pit, or even as Origin is saying, one transitional watering, decanting, whatever, swimming pool, whatever it is. These are really arid environments and animals will smell and see water from really long distances. And as I go about my work, I see animals heading to billabongs. If I've got Aboriginal people in the car, they'll always say, they know where that snake is going. They know what billabong that snake is going to. They know why that animal is travelling at that time of day in the direction that it is. And it's for water. And I just thought one open evap pit and this scene could be gone. Depending on the degree of concentration of chemical in that pit at that time, this could just be annihilated overnight. And at that point I thought, okay, I'm back into this story. So if we can just these two movies, they're tiny, but they just give you an idea of what is out in this nothingness. So that swirl on the horizon is the birds. You see that grey cloud at the back there? That's the birds. And you can't see that they're streaming over, but if we could go to the next image, shows that they are streaming over. And the noise was deafening because this is just one side, but they were behind me, they were they were everywhere.
Did you identify what they were?
They were green parrots.
What?
Little grass parrots, little green grass parrots. I don't know. No, they weren't quite budgies, a little bit bigger. Green, someone called them a grass parrot to me.
Thank you.
Okay, but that in an evap pit or an open pond I treat animals, not daily, but in veterinary practice, I treat a lot of animals for ethylene glycol for bleach, for all these household, yes, it's great to say, yeah, they're safe and they're on every shelf, but you don't say give them to your kids or animals to drink, you know, and I see in the early bit of the report that I did get to read was just this statement again of most of these products are relatively benign, and the fact is they're not. You know, ethylene glycol is a really significant toxin, and a lot of these products are really significant toxins. And I would just ask the panel to sort of review the toxicology. I don't know if any of you are toxicologists, but
we do have an he's not here, but we have an ecotoxicologist on the panel.
Make sure that people have an understanding of what is being used, at what rates of dilution, and if we are using evap ponds, what do we get down to? You know, are we knocking them on the head by wanting to have a drink? And look, you could say, and I'm sure Origin and the rest of them will say, we'll net them or we'll put protective barriers on the ground and stuff. And if we could just go to these 3 photos. So my husband's family have land at Tennant Creek. And years ago, they agreed to a cyanide dam being put on their property as a processing for the tailings dam. You know, there was going to be cyanide in that pond. It's now known as Skull Flat, and it's known as Skull Flat because everything that drank from that pond died, okay? And so it's now colloquially, it is Skull Flat. What you see here is we're 30 years down the track. So they left the pond open for about 7 years for it to become Skull Flat with nobody closing that pond. And then when finally they were pushed to close that pond, they did it by simple infill. So you can see the torn black plastic liner there, and that's what you're left with. And if you just flick through the next couple of photos, so that's the runoff off the area. And there should be another one or two. That's now the signage with a broken barbed wire fence that exists at 30 years. And it's still a toxic area, and that is Skull Flat. And I should have a comparative photo of what the vegetation looks everywhere else, but we were just on a Christmas Day sort of walk in the afternoon to Skull Flat, as you do. But it's, you know, the whole runoff from that pond is complete devastation. And that is considered really normal in the Northern Territory. Like, nobody has questioned that, nobody has suggested, could somebody come and have a look at this? Nobody has said, could we fence it better? That stuff's normal. So the margins on what mining companies can get away with up here are so much vaster than anywhere else in Australia, because there is an acceptance that mining companies come in and trash land. So immediately when you have that acceptance, you're in a different framework from the kickoff. You know, what people are seeing as they're driving by is accepted because it's accepted. So I just wanted to show you those because they're just personal accounts of what it feels like to actually be a Territorian living with this as an impending industry. I'd say that the knowledge of the fauna in these areas is probably 0 to none. You'll have, you know, significant local knowledge from Indigenous people, but in terms of numbers and populations and potential for populations to be disrupted, I think, you know, you're dreaming if you think you've got any data there. And the attitude to it within the Northern Territory. There's one station that was, I just did a 1080 dog baiting course, you know, as part of the job that I do. And in the process, the guy who was delivering the course just, you know, mentioned that one station has just been issued with 5,000 1080 baits to aerial drop on their property. Now, 5,000 1080 baits on one station, it doesn't matter how big the station is, okay, is a massive, massive number of baits. When we know that 1080 bait have collateral damage, we know anything that eats anything that's eaten 1080 is also going to die.
For those of us who come from the inner city suburbs of Sydney, what is a 1080 bait? So
1080 bait, it's a dried meat bait that's then injected with a poison called 1080, and it's fed to wild dogs to kill them, to stop calf predation in cattle industries. There's other ways of going about it, but that is, you know, one method of wild dog control adopted by some stations. Some stations are working in other ways to limit predation by looking at building up normal dingo populations, because 1080, of course, will kill dingoes as well. And there's conflicting debate about what is the best approach, okay? But when I heard that one station had been delivered and approved by Department of Primary Industry, has to approve it, 5,000 baits, you have to question what's going down. It's an incredibly toxic substance that many animals are affected by, not just dogs. And that will be aerial dropped. They'll for 5,000, I can't imagine you doing anything but aerial dropping. They probably are, but there'll be a lot of hope. I hope she lands in the right spot with that. But that just gives you an idea of the respect that's given to local fauna and native fauna up here. Essentially, I see that to some extent we're going to be guinea pigs, and the more I talk, I always approach Origin at the show or whoever's there, and Apia and all those guys, they know me quite well. But the more I talk to them, the more I'm clear that we are that their technology obviously isn't set in stone. Their technology isn't golden, because once technology is golden, you stick with it. But what we've actually got is evolving and emerging technology. And all that says to me is they haven't got it right yet. Or they wouldn't need to be advancing further. If they had something that was foolproof, they wouldn't be investing in a lot more investment in technology. The idea of these multi-pad wells, the tentacle wells. When I was talking to David at the show down here, and he says, oh yeah, I said, when is the first one? Which is a really important question, I think, to keep asking at all of these intervals that you have. When was the first one done? How many have you done? So the first tentacle well pad was 2008. So we've got 8 years of longitudinal study on something, on a new technology, which, as far as I'm concerned in this industry, isn't long enough. How long is the longest tentacle that you have drilled? Ever, on a single horizontal or a multi-pad stage, and it's 4 kilometres. How often have you done that? Not quite sure, but the longest is 4 kilometres. And I just think asking them to really define, so that we've got a sense of what degree of data we've got, because it's really easy for these guys to sit here and sound really good. You watch that and you think, these guys have got it all sorted. But then you step away from it and just go, no, 8 years is nothing in the scheme of a rock and Mother Nature. When I hear them talking that they will work through a wet season, and I just think, wow, in that area, and in Daily Waters when she floods, and anybody, it's fine to say, yeah, the biggest rainfall is 342 in a 3-day period or whatever, but what that does on a ground level in that country is very, very different to what it does in a ground level in Darwin even. It is that red soil country is really, really different. And a lot of those cyclones come across with a decent blow still by the time they get to Beetaloo. If they've tracked through Borroloola and kept on coming, they'll still have a bit of form to them by the time they hit that area. So the idea that they suggest that, yeah, we're going to be all weather and all go, to me it's just like, my God, do you really appreciate where you are and what this place can hold, and doesn't for a lot of years, but what it can do, because it can be pretty special what Mother Nature can do here. And I wonder about the depth of their appreciation of that, and I feel it's probably a little lacking, by the statements that were made today. The other thing that you face in the territory, and I'm sure you're aware of, is that we have a Berrima line, or what's probably now a Palmerston line. Okay, so the ability for people who are going to be affected by this stuff to really have a voice that counts, and for a knowledge from what is really happening out here to get to Darwin. I was away at the weekend with a group of women who I would consider would be more switched on to the environment than most. Okay, and when I spoke about Mount Todd and what was happening there with cadmium levels at the Daly River mouth, and what was happening with the smoking stack at Borroloola, they had no idea of those events, okay? So we live in a space where mining companies can get away with blue murder and do get away with blue murder. I have a lot of friends who have worked on and off these sites over years, and they describe what happens once she starts to rain in these places as absolutely criminal. And what they're referring to is the discharge of water from Ranger Mine, from Mount Todd Mine. Glencore's a different situation, but those discharges that occur at peak rain points and with the knowledge of when inspectors are coming, they define themselves and their guys who work in the industry all the time as completely criminal. And they're people who have worked on the East Coast in coal industry, have seen what regulated industry looks like, and what they feel they deal with here is completely unregulated industry that pays lip service to inspectors knowing full well when they're coming. So, I mean, I'm imagining you're aware of what's happening at Borroloola, what's happening at the Daly River mouth. I imagine you guys are across that, you know?
Well, we've been, it's been disclosed to us in consultations.
Yeah, good. All the sustainable yield stuff, I mean, I don't know where the data's coming from, but I know that as of a couple of years ago, there was very, very limited data located at community points only across the territory. And I have to wonder about an industry that is doing its own water monitoring. All of this idea of self-regulation, I think, is really fraught in the territory. I think it's probably fraught anywhere, but I think it's more fraught in the territory where it's not under observation from passers-by, and where you have a largely fly-in, fly-out workforce, so that, you know, your ability to get the message out of what is happening on site in these places is really quite restricted. But yeah, any time you've got self-regulation, I think you're looking down the barrel of a gun up here. You talk in the report about the precautionary principle, and that's like, we just don't have any longitudinal studies for what they're proposing. So how you can enact a precautionary principle when we have no longitudinal studies is beyond me. Like, it just doesn't, the two are mutually exclusive, I would suggest. Yeah, that's all I can say to that. I just don't understand how you can have an industry that isn't operating and has no longitudinal data to say that we're putting it... Do you see what I mean? Like,
No, I do.
Yeah. Anywhere in the NT, like, the idea that these sites are going to be regenerated, I'm yet to see it anywhere. It just, all I have seen of regeneration is gamba grass infiltration, or whatever the local weed is, infiltrate massive tracts of land unless they're full of cyanide where nothing can grow. But I'm yet to see any good regeneration in any location at all. That includes Gove, where they've tried really quite hard. But we've got such a fragile topsoil that the minute you move that and you're onto a baked clay base, you're pushing it uphill to try and get anything to grow, you know, so weeds are the only thing. Yeah, so that's probably enough said from me. I just heard a guy, and I wish I sort of took it down, I was driving, so I didn't, but he was an eminent gas expert of America. He was sort of one of the leaders of this fracking revolution in America. And he's now stepped aside to the next energy industry and has written a book on gas as a transitional fuel. And I would have to question, if it is a transitional fuel, do we really need to sell our souls to it? You know, if we're talking about he was talking on the radio about a 30-year diminishing requirement for gas across the world, and that it really was now seen as a transitional fuel. And this guy's a hero of gas. I wish I had his name for you. But I just wonder, are we really doing this? You know, what are we doing? What political... It defies logic to me, with all the inherent risks of this industry. and with the known state of play in the Northern Territory, I just wonder what the underpinning of the driver of this industry actually is, you know. And I think, knowing the Territory as I do, it's probably relatively small. It's relatively nepotistic in the machine that is actually driving and opening the door for these gas giants to come in. You know, there are small people or big people, big quiet people in the Northern Territory who stand to gain significant profit from this, and they are politically very connected, and they have created this machine that is now allowing the Origins to sit here and look pretty good. And I just have to wonder what we're actually doing in that context and in that space. It's an industry that relies on an economy of scale. So anything that is said about what we're going to be and how small we're going to be, I just would have significant doubts about. And when you look at what's happened across the Darling Downs region, I think, you know, the economies of scale that are required to make this machine work are not something that, as a territory, we should be looking at. And I just see your role as really important because there are many in government who won't even read a full report, but will read the recommendations. And your recommendations, David from Origin was talking to me at the show and he said, I don't even understand where this public concern, like he sees it as an overrated public concern, has come from when you compare it to other industries in the Territory. And I said to him, I think it really is from the fact that we have a government who is pro, we have an industry with a dubious moral compass, and as a people, as a result, as a people, we feel we need to be the policeman of this industry. And your recommendations are the only thing that actually give the people of the Northern Territory, who pretty much uniformly do not want this industry. I know there are exceptional groups to that, but if you know, I think the Lock the Gate figures are probably pretty true, pretty accurate, possibly swinging, you know, to a 15% group of people that might think it's okay now, but I think the overwhelming majority of Territorians do not want this industry. And it's your recommendations that will actually be the voice that allows us the next layer of brokerage in a space where we actually have none, because deals from where we sit are very much done.
So no pressure then?
No, that's right. Just sleep well tonight. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No, so we will make the recommendations we make. What government does with those recommendations will be a matter for government.
Yeah.
And you, I might add, you also. Thank you very much, and particularly in the circumstances that you've described of being ill. We're very grateful for the time and the commitment that you've displayed today by coming and speaking, and I think you've raised a number of very important points. One thing I do want to say about this sort of thing, and we've had a number of people come and say to us that, you know, government employees have been gagged. This is what they've told us. I'm just repeating what they've told us, and that people haven't been able to come to the inquiry and speak freely as they wished. That we do have, for what they're worth, the feedback forms under the Have Your Say, which are confidential. You can make them not confidential, but they can certainly be confidential. So far, we've received, I think, 181 of those forms. So there is at least a confidential mechanism for people to voice what they want to say, and that, as I said, there's no name attached to that. So if you know of anybody who does want to have their say in a confidential manner, I urge them to go to the website and fill out one of the forms, and as I said, we get that information.
Yep.
Okay. Any questions at all? Yes, Dr. Anderson.
Got a couple. Thanks very much for your presentation. And my first question concerns the lack of longitudinal experience you talked about and the precautionary principle. And I was just wondering if you could give us more of your thoughts about that, in the sense of any new industry obviously doesn't have a longitudinal history by definition. situation. And if you don't allow something to happen, you'll never get a longitudinal history. And so how do you see the precautionary principle then operating in that context?
Okay, I'd say if we had no energy for ourselves in the Northern Territory right now, and it becomes a cost-benefit story, doesn't it? So if all we are chasing is an export dollar out of Gladstone, then I would say that we are very cautious about what we do, given the potential to damage our water supply. If we had no energy to fuel the Northern Territory right at this point in time, I would be saying, okay, we've got to take a bit of a risk here, you know, but I don't see us in that position. And I think, yeah, does that explain my view on it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. My second question concerns wet season operations, and you talk about the propensity for very major floods throughout even the semi-arid part of the Northern Territory. And I was just wondering, given that any surface water would be held in above ground ponds or even totally enclosed, what do you see the concern then of these floods? How would they impact?
It gives a lovely opportunity to open a valve and allow fresh water to fall into the pond. So if you're dealing with a highly concentrated chemical and you don't quite know what you're going to do with it, and it's pretty expensive to send it to a water treatment plant in Brisbane, but you've got 4 inches of surface water flowing everywhere, no brainer. Turn the valve on, fellas. Let it go.
You think there'll be a deliberate...
Absolutely.
Okay.
It happens at Mount Todd, it happens at Ranger, it happens in multiple mine sites all over the Territory all the time. Yeah. So that's what I see as one of the, you know, and just simple, you know, not being in attendance and having those overflow, you know, Christmas, everybody's gone home. The big cyclone comes, nobody can get back out there because the strip's closed. Nobody can get back out there for 3 weeks, but it rains for 2 weeks solid. What happens to those tanks in that time? You know? I'm yet to see a well-regulated industry or well-monitored industry in the Northern Territory in this kind of sector that would give me faith in their desire or ability to control an industry like this.
Any other comments, questions?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and presenting today. And that